I pay my respectable salute to all the martyrs who fought for the freedom of India. From Jhansi Ki Rani, Mangal Pandey to Gandhiji, all dreamt of an independent India. Chandrasekhar Azad, Bhagat Singh, and Subhas Chandra Bose were those freedom fighters who never bothered about their life to fight for the independence of India. We fondly remember them and their sacrifice. One of them gave us the most revolutionary lines, far from Rangoon, "Tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga," and one of his slogan became the slogan of the nation, Jai Hind. Yes, I am talking about none other than Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. We fondly remember him through his daughter, Anita Bose. Today, she will take us back to those pages of history where the world was fighting Second World War, and on the other hand, Netaji and Emily Bose gave birth to a beautiful baby, Anita, today who is with us. That baby never thought that she will become the witness of the greatest battle, the battle of independence of India.
Anita, in the whole world, Subhas Chandra Bose's name is considered an example of patriotism. To you, however, he is your father, how you feel it?
As a doctor, I always had both aspects to consider. Of course, I consider the historical person, but also the personal side of it. And since I was very young when he left, and I didn't really know him personally, of course, the personal image of the father was more the reflection of what I heard about him.
When you were little, you don't remember Netaji's face, but whatever you read or saw about him, which kind of image comes to your mind?
Well, the image changed over time. Of course, when I was a little kid, it was more the image of the father who was not there,
right.
whom I would have liked to be there. But as I grew older, I also sort of learned more about the public figure and the family figure in general, also his relationship to his Indian part of the family,
Yes.
not only to my mother.
Right.
And that, of course, added many facets, and I also came to appreciate the historical figure that he was.
Yes. In which situation your mother met Netaji first time?
My parents met in 1934 for the first time. My father had been released from prison on the condition that he would go abroad to get medical treatment because he was released because his health was very bad. And Vienna was a center of medical knowledge at that time.
Right.
And so he went to Vienna and wanted to get treatment there. And at the same time, he was planning to work on a book. He had a contract from a publisher for the book, The Indian Struggle.
Right.
And he was looking for a secretary.
Yes.
So one of the Indian students ran an English conversation course in Vienna, and my mother was a member of that.
Right.
And my father approached this student and asked him whether he knew of any person who could work as his secretary.
Yes.
And so this student said, yeah, he knew of two ladies who might know enough English to help him in that. And so my mother went for a job interview to him, and that was in June of 1934. And
Okay.
This is when they first met.
Oh, 1934.
Yes.
Perfect. Were you named by Netaji?
No, as far as I know, I was named by both my parents. Actually, I was named after Anita Garibaldi. She was the wife of the Italian patriot Giuseppe Garibaldi, who fought to unite Italy.
Right.
And his wife was still quite young, actively supported him in his armed struggle.
Right.
And in fact, there is a statue of Anita Garibaldi with a baby in her arms on horseback.
Yes.
In Rome, and my mother felt that this was a good name because it was both a European and an Indian sounding name at least.
Yes.
or an Indian name also, and on the other hand, the attitude of Anita Garibaldi was something which meant something to my father.
Yes, yes.
So this is how I got the name. Of course, at that time it was a bit questionable whether this name would be acceptable. I was born in the then German Empire, and at that time very Germanic names were in vogue, and Anita was an Italian name, not a German name at that time, although today it is a very popular German name too. And so at that time it was not possible to name your children, give your children any foreign name. Even today there are some restrictions. And so my mother was a bit worried that Anita would not be acceptable, so in which case I would have gotten Anita as a second name, but as it turned out, Anita was okay, and so this is my first name, and the name by which I was also called.
All right, thank you. Would you like to be a practice in politics if you were in India?
Well, if I had been in India for a long time, it possibly might have been an option, but I'm not so sure that it would have been an option which would have suited me very well. Because I'm a very independent person, and I want to be myself, not just the daughter of somebody or the wife of somebody. And I don't know whether I would have been able to be an independent person in my own right in India going into politics. Going into a totally different field like science or academics or so on, yes, but in politics I would always have been sort of tied to my father and looked upon as the daughter of my father. And it might even have been difficult to have my own opinion if it, according to some people, did not agree with what they thought my father would have thought.
Okay. So how many children you have?
I have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. And the children are, of course, quite grown up now, and the grandchildren are the oldest one is 21, and the youngest one is just 6 weeks old.
And you keeping an Indian name of your children's. So what was the reason behind of that, keeping Indian names?
Well, both my husband and I have a very close and emotional tie to India, of course, and so we felt that giving them a European or a Western name and an Indian name would sort of combine the two backgrounds which children have. And in fact, my grandchildren also have Indian second names.
Great, thank you. Nice to hear that. Okay, how you feel when you went to India first time?
That's a long time ago, of course. I was about 18 at that time, and if I recall correctly what I felt at that time, of course it was a feeling of great expectation and excitement, because there are many things I did not know, and I of course imagined maybe in a different way from what the immediate experience was.
Yes.
And I think what probably struck me as the most surprising thing, which I did not expect to that degree, was the fact that my father was still held in very great affection, and surprisingly enough he still is. Even if I look at people who have never seen him, who were born long after independence, today I find that he is respected and loved by many. Of course, some don't know anything about the Indian independence struggle, but that's a different matter. But it's surprising how many do, and how many still hold great respect and affection for him. And of course, in 1960-61, when I visited for the first time, which is 50 years ago now, that was much more the case. I mean, there were many people alive, of course, who who had seen him personally, who had known him personally, and the excitement was even greater then.
Yes, yes. Okay, so when you went to second time in India?
Much later, it was about, it was in 1979, so it was about 19 years later, 18, 19 years later.
How do you feel when you step your father's native land?
Of course, the first experience was that of a strange land, but I was very surprised that within a very short time I developed an affinity and an emotional tie to the country, which of course was very different from visiting other countries.
Yes.
So in a way, I think that maybe blood is thicker than water, as they sometimes say, that India had this quality of a homeland even then, within a short period of time.
Perfect. Thank you. Netaji used to be a respect of his elder brother. So when you went to meet Sharad Babu, did he also respect you?
Well, I don't know whether you could say that you respect a 6-year-old child when my uncle, my second uncle actually, my father had after all several brothers, and his favorite brother to whom he was closest was his second brother, Subhas
Yes.
Chandra Bose. When he came to visit my mother and me in Austria, I was 6, and I think it was rather exciting for all of us. Of course, it was very exciting for me to meet an uncle, and he was the second person from that side of the family to me, whom I met. One of my cousins had come to visit earlier, and so he came with his wife and 3 of his children to meet us. And I think it was also exciting to him. I still remember my mother telling me that they had decided to come and visit in the afternoon, and then they were so curious that they showed up in the morning already. And in fact, I was out visiting a friend, so my mother had to get me back. And I remember my uncle took me on his lap and looked at me, and I think everybody says I resemble my father a lot, and so I think it was something that was also exciting for him.
Sure. Your picture, when I saw your picture and Netaji's picture, looks identical face.
Of course, if I recall the meeting, I think I was more interested even in the ladies in the party, my aunt and my cousins. My 2 cousins were 2 beautiful young women, and my aunt was a very impressive elderly lady. And I was very impressed by the sari and the prettiness and all
Yes,
that.
yes.
So that was almost more interesting than the old uncle and my other cousin. And I couldn't talk to my uncle, of course, but we sort of, with a few words of English that I knew, we sort of,
Because the language
the
barrier.
time my mother had coached me to how to greet him and so on. And so that was a very nice meeting. And then I only met him a second time a year later when he went to Switzerland for medical treatment. And he asked my mother and me to join him and his wife there. And we spent about, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 weeks together in Switzerland. I don't know how long. And we used to take walks together, have meals together, and so on. And of course, my mother had more of a conversation with him and her sister-in-law.
Yes.
But I sort of got to know him a little better then.
So how old are you when in Switzerland when you meet Sharad Babu?
And I was about 7.
7. I mean 1 year later. When I first met you in Vienna.
Yeah, in 48 we met for the first time, and I just had turned 6, and in fact some photos were taken on my 6th birthday with my mother, myself, and my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins, and my mother and myself. And then the year after, he went to Switzerland for the medical treatment, so I was, well, not quite 7 yet.
Anita ji, what do you consider your father's most important contribution to India's freedom? He wanted the people to understand the meaning of freedom before the gaining independence.
My father had, of course, many different roles over time, and I think one of his major contributions to India's freedom was the enthusiasm that he could inspire in other people in the fight for independence, because he himself was a very enthusiastic and patriotic leader with a lot of charisma and a lot of commitment. And in fact, I think that was one quality of many of the heroes of the independence struggle, that they really had a total commitment to their country.
Yes.
A very selfless commitment in many instances, sacrificing everything, including their lives very often, for India's independence. And I think that, of course, meant something to other people who followed in that. And if anything, I think the everyday politics of any country differ in that respect. I mean, the everyday problems, negative developments like corruption and so on, give a negative example of leadership very often. And on the other hand, the Indian independence heroes really excelled by their personality, by their integrity and so on. And I think my father certainly was a very outstanding person that way. To quote Mahatma Gandhi, he called him a patriot of patriots. And my father, by the way, called Gandhi the father of our nation.
Yes.
That was the title, so to say, which he gave him.
Right.
So even though they had differences in their political opinions, I think there was a mutual respect, especially, of course, from my father towards Gandhi, who was, after all, the father's generation for him. So I think this was certainly a very important aspect. The other aspect is my father, after all, was a trained administrator. He was an ICS graduate.
Yes.
He would have gotten an ICS appointment, but he declined. And as such, he also had a pragmatic view towards administering a country. He was mayor of Calcutta at one stage, and could also and had to bring to bear his administrative qualities there.
Yes.
And had a very extensive idea of what he imagined India to be after independence, and to take along the people in this attempt, not only men but also women. That was one very important aspect in his leadership, that he felt that women also had to contribute to the struggle for independence in many different walks of life, also as soldiers, by the way. He had a women's corps in the Indian National Army, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment,
Yes.
Whose commander-in-chief was Dr. Lakshmi, then Swaminathan, now Segal. She's still alive.
Right.
So he tried to imbibe in people also what India had to do after independence, what it meant. And I think that is an important part, because I think many countries have experienced that after independence, the practical side of really instituting a nation building and administering a country is a difficult task, and it takes a lot of effort and commitment and training and all that. And I think at least to some extent, I think he was probably quite aware that it would be a difficult task that was ahead of the country. Of course, on the other hand, I imagine that everyone at the time, including himself, hoped that many of the things would improve much faster, that poverty, illiteracy, poor health would be eliminated much faster than it actually happened.
Yes.
But I think he was quite aware of some of the problems, and in some of his writings and speeches he went into some of the problems which later on occurred, for example, population development and many other aspects. And so I think looking ahead certainly was an important aspect.
Do you have any such thing which is Netaji have brought just for you?
Not that I recall really. My father, of course, saw me once when I was, for a couple of days, when I was about 4 weeks old. And I think it must have been an exciting thing for him too. Or it's for any father, I think, to have your own, see your own first child. But there's nothing that he brought sort of as a gift. And of course he left very shortly after I was born. In fact, the original plans had been to leave earlier, and he would not have seen me at all in that case. But he left when I was about, left Germany by submarine when I was about, beginning of, I was about 2-3 months old.
Yes. Do your kids ever ask about their grandpa? Means Netaji?
Yeah, well, of course they do, and they're interested. And one of our sons was a student of philosophy and history, so he is also interested as a historian. And also the other children were interested in learning about their grandfather. Of course, had they lived in India, I'm sure they would have gotten a lot more of the effects than they did learning about it here. And of course, as they grew up, they also read about him. For our children, their Indian heritage was important too, even though they have only visited for short periods. The tie to India was always a very real one, both to our relatives, but also in, for example, in naming their own children. Our 2 sons, who have children of their own, have also given their children Indian middle names.
Indian middle name. This is great. So, how long have you stayed with your mother, and when you were moved from Vienna to Germany?
I stayed with my mother till I got married at age 22 and a half, and then actually I didn't move to Germany straight away, but I moved to the United States. My husband is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and after his graduation at the University of Pennsylvania and mine at the University of Vienna, we lived in the United States for a few years. First he was a professor at at different universities, and then a few years later I became a professor, assistant professor at the university too, and we stayed there till
United States.
Yeah, we stayed in the United States for about 6 to 8 years. Then for a couple of years we commuted, half a year United States, half a year Germany, and then eventually with 2 children we decided we had to stay in one place, and we settled in Germany.
Have you invited to the Indian government?
The Indian government invited me some years ago to discuss the question of my father's remains, but usually when I went to India, I went either for the first visit at the invitation of my family, and the other visits to India were on my own, just as a private visitor to mainly family, little bit of tourism.
Right.
And visiting friends and the like. But I have been asked by the Indian government to come for the discussion of my father's remains around the time of his 100th birthday, his birth centenary, a little earlier than that.
Anita ji, how you remember India? Father's country or country's father?
Well, how do I remember India? Well, partly, of course, I remember it as my father's country, but I think I also remember India as a very important country, a global player, as one would say today, in the economy and in international politics.
Yes.
And I think with all the problems that India faces, I think India certainly has a very important role to play in the world, and has a lot of potential also. Of course, a lot of problems to deal with that continues, but hopefully the positive sides of the more recent development will dominate the situation and will also enable the country to deal with some of the problems.
Yes.
Some of these are economic, of course, but that it's not only economic. I think a lot of that is also, I would consider, cultural, attitudinal, and so on. Of course, one of the great problems of India, apart from poverty and illiteracy, is the fact that there is a lot of corruption in the country, which is like a cancer, I think, and hampers the development. And I certainly hope that slow improvements will be achieved in that direction, because I think ultimately with an excessive amount of corruption things become much more difficult to improve the life of the ordinary people also.
If you were ever got to chance to talk to your father, what was the question you asked him first?
That's difficult to say. If I were to...
It means if he's still alive.
Well, of course,
first question.
one has to put that in a historic perspective, because first of course, for our practical purposes, he could not be alive today. So it wouldn't be so much a question of what he would do today or what he would advise today. But I think...
well, it means when you grown up like 12 or 15, like teenagers that time, if he's alive.
Well, probably as a child I would also have asked him some more personal questions. As a grown-up, probably I would have asked him more about what he felt about the development of his country, whether he felt that his own ideas had been correct in all aspects when he was involved in the struggle for independence, or whether he realized that some problems were somewhat different from what he originally imagined them to be. I'm sure he probably would have hoped that the positive developments would have taken off much faster than they actually did. But I guess looking at the development as an onlooker, if he had been asked, say, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, he may have realized that some dynamics take place in a society,
Yes.
which make it even more difficult than what you feel to begin with, to change something. There's a lot of social inertia, I would call it.
Yes.
And it takes a long time till education, for example, which is one of the keys of improvement, is sufficiently widespread to have an overall effect. That's a long-term effect and a long-term investment. I guess if I had asked him as an adult, I would have probably tried to ask him, discuss with him where his own expectations had been different and how his views would have changed. I think that would have been almost more interesting. When I was a child, probably it would have been more of a personal question of involving also my personal relationship to him, which never developed because he wasn't there.
How much you attach to the Indian culture?
Indian culture had a very important effect over the centuries and millennia. Of course, India certainly was one of the cradles of great civilizations and cultural development. Two great world religions emerged from there, which of course give a long-term perspective on the culture. But I think for today's life, unless you study this as a historian, it's more a question of how these long-term developments translate into recent and modern developments. What do they mean? And I think certainly you can find some characteristics in India, culturally speaking, which are sort of typically Indian, so to say. I think there's a certain interest in knowledge, in education, for example, in spite of the fact that you have a lot of illiteracy and a very slow improvement on that front. But I think there was always an orientation towards education, towards philosophy, towards mathematics, and so on, and an inclination of at least the, if you want to call it elite, towards education. And I think that is an important factor today too. That is why India, I think is making headway in some of the economic sectors which are sort of information and knowledge based. And I think that's, of course, the computer industry, the software industry is only one side of that. But I think this orientation towards knowledge is important. And the interesting question is going to be in India, and as in any other country, how traditional values and characteristics transform into something what you might call modern. And my own hope and image, of course, is that to its people, particularly to those not so well off, not so lucky in terms of being born into an educated and wealthy family, but who have to make it. And I think we can only hope that this orientation towards knowledge and education would translate into something positive in India.
When we talk about heroes of freedom, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose is remembered as a great revolutionary. He is a creator of slogan Jai Hind. What do you think in the difference of between Gandhiwad or Subhaswad?
Gandhi's orientation towards independence was very strongly rooted in his own experience, of course, also in civil disobedience, in non-violence. That meant a lot to him. And my father, on the other hand, did not exclude also a violent form of struggle for independence. That was, of course, the great difference between them, or one of the great differences. We can only speculate what was in people's minds as long as they did not voice it directly, but I have a feeling that as Indian independence drew closer, in a way, somehow the outlook of Mahatma Gandhi and of my father had more in common than before. Before that, I think the idea of non-violence or violence was a dividing issue to them. But towards the end, I have a feeling that the question of the partition of the country became a very important issue, and Mahatma Gandhi was rather left alone by his own close followers who sort of went ahead with the idea of gaining independence in a two-state version. And my father was always opposed to partition, and of course I think his attitude towards Muslims was also different
Right.
from many of the other Hindu leaders, possibly also inspired by the fact that he had grown up in a predominantly Muslim state or province then in Bengal, and at that time at least, with all problems that certainly exist between religions and subcultures, these different groups got along.
Right.
There were always some issues on Muslim and Hindu participation in political and other aspects, but in a way I think there was possibly more understanding and tolerance for Muslims than in what it appeared to be many of the other Hindu leaders. So the idea of partition, also for historical reasons, I think was not at all appealing to him. And if we look at the history of the partition, of course, that is a very sad story. I mean, the fact of having hundreds and thousands of people lose their lives on both sides, and having several wars, and two countries squandering their funds in an excessive amount on defense expenditure, where other expenditures might have been more important, certainly was not a win-win situation.
Right.
And Gandhi, for these and other reasons, probably was also opposed to partition, and it was all the people around him who sort of went ahead with accepting partition, and he was rather left alone. And I sometimes wonder if my father had still been around then, whether together they might have changed something. I would imagine that possibly if they had both been there, then at least they would have changed something about the quality of relationship between the two states.
Yes.
Of course, there's another problem involved, that is, unfortunately, Pakistan had a rather extensive degree of political instability, which made things very difficult. But I guess that aspect sort of brought them together, even though in earlier days of the independence struggle they had rather different ideas. And I think Gandhi was a very shrewd real politician, and I think he in many ways outmaneuvered my father quite successfully. And later on, I guess they came to appreciate each other's position more in some ways than it had been in the beginning.
Yes. Anita ji, how you celebrate your father's birthday?
Well, we are not a great birthday celebrating family in general. We don't usually have any big celebrations as such. Sometimes we do something, sometimes we don't, but that also happens to other members of the family. For example, those who are not around usually don't actively celebrate, and those who stay behind do. So it's not no formal event as such.
Now I have a question about your husband, and when you met him first time, when you got engaged and get married, if he's around here, can you meet him?
Well, my husband and I met first when I came to India for the first time, because he had gone to India first with the idea of having really a sort of pilgrimage, in the sense that he was looking at different religions and was wondering as a teenager which religion produced the best man. And he felt that India was the one country where you had most religions coexist.
Right.
So the idea was that maybe that would give him an impression of which is the best religion. Going to India, of course, he found that all religions produce good and bad people. But anyway, he managed to gain lots of insights, but he also had a very practical involvement. He helped an Indian priest from South India start a school for the blind, and then he initiated 2 schools in other parts of the country. And he spent about 4 years there. And during that period, I came for my first birthday. During that period, I went to India for the first time, and I also came to Bangalore, where he had been living for several years and working for the School for the Blind
In Bangalore.
in Whitefield near Bangalore, as in an honorary capacity.
Right.
And this is during that period we met the mayor of, ex-mayor of Bangalore had given a reception for me, and my husband had gotten himself invited to the reception, and that's where he saw me for the first time. And even though I was a teenager then,
How old were you that time?
I was 18.
18.
He was impressed that I was quite mature already for my age, and then managed to meet me. And this
So you
is
met
how
in
we,
India first
yeah,
time?
this is how we got to know each other.
So you met in India. This is great
Yeah.
to know that. Anita ji, can you meet your husband and your kids and your grandchildren, please? if
Yes,
they are here?
yeah, you can meet those who are here. Not all of them are here, but my husband is here, and my daughter, and 2 of my grandchildren.
And give me something about your husband's qualification and when he comes up here, and about your daughter, what she do, and your other children, and which kind of diploma degree they have from university, and what they do right now.
Okay, well, my husband can talk about his own qualifications
sure.
in more detail, but
Right.
he is a retired professor of economics, and he is an ex-member of the German parliament.
Yes.
And right now he calls himself a writer. He is writing an autobiography and busy with other things.
That's very good.
That is, to some extent, the academicians always sort of remain active to some extent in their own field of life. Our oldest son is a journalist. He's working for the Bavarian television and making movies and doing different other things.
What is his name?
He's Peter Orun.
Peter Arun.
And he is the father of 2 children, a 21-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter, almost 10-year-old daughter. And
What is their name?
and the grandson is Nico Peter Orun, and the daughter is Pia Oruna.
Pia Aruna.
So Nico is a student of mathematics, and Pia is of course still in school.
And your other son?
The second son is Thomas Krishna. He is in the IT field. He is a systems engineer, and he is married to a doctor, and has 2 little sons. One is 2 years old, and the little one is just 6 weeks old now.
And how about your daughter?
And our daughter is a marine biologist. She lives in South Africa and has just finished her PhD and is working
So
on.
she's now a doctor, right?
Yeah, she's working on a research project for the University of Cape Town, and she has no children.
She's around here in this.
No, she just happens to visit.
So means we had lucky time to have.
Yeah, as my grandson put it, you happen to meet the infrequent visitors to this place.
I'm so glad. I'm so happy.
The sons live close by, but they are both working right now and off to their jobs. And it's really a coincidence that the oldest grandson happened to visit, and well, his little sister, who also visits today, lives here, so she comes quite often. Come on, Mr. Zucker. Come meet my husband.
Yes.
Hello, Martin. How are you?
Sorry.
Sit down.
Fine. How about yourself?
I'm all right, sir.
Yes.
I heard about you a lot of things, and when you were a professor, and how do you make Anita Ji?
Well, I saw her first on the cover page of an Indian newspaper when she was a guest of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru,
Right.
holding a camera in her hand, so as if he were to explain the functioning of the camera to her, but actually I know she's very technically competent. Anyway, then I saw her on the cover page of the Femina magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I still have the picture. And thirdly, she was a guest of the mayor of Bangalore, giving a speech at the town hall. And I was there, and I was very much
What time?
involved.
How long was it?
That was in 1961.
Oh.
Jai Hind.
This is good. All right. Thank you very much,
Okay.
and see you next time.
Goodbye, and all the best to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have a safe journey, and
Thank you very much.
Macht euer Leben weiter.
I don't usually cut the pizza either.
I should cut the pizza.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, that's going to spoil my image in India, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what's necessary, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
All the same.
Ich hab hier auf die Seite.
Yeah, come here.
Ich hab dich auch schon.
Okay. Danke.
That's the good way.
Okay, let's hope that will work. Yeah, it works. Here it has been cut.
Habe ich schon gesehen.
Yeah, it will
Kann man
not.
auch hochgehen.
It has to work in the kitchen. That will really spoil my image in India, huh?
It's not in India.
Huh?
Not spoiling.
Better sitting in the chair like a pasha there inside, that's how you want.
Okay, there's two more.
Oh, two more.
there's two more.
Wow.
Okay, okay.
So there's one with.
Two more.
So wir sehen einfach so.
Yeah, do you mind if we serve the pizza in the carton? Because if you put it on the plate, it's going to get cold.
No, no.
Everyone can help himself to come.
Yeah, we'll take this inside and
You put it in one.
yeah, okay.
By the way, or-
No, wait, everybody can fish.
Sorry for making you starve because
yeah. Oh,
it was so late.
saved by the phone. Hello.
I think I can do a better job at this.
Here we go. You smart. You know the faster way to do it.
Aber Schatzi, kannst du mich an meinen Schreibtisch verbinden?
Oh,
Oder
smart,
hier ist
aber
gerade
not
was los.
Einen Moment.
You are smart, Maya. Yes. Yes. That's supposed to man, and this isn't. My target is perfect. I love it.
Okay.
Great honor to be talk to you also there, man. Here, really.
Like
Oh no, mom told me you're not gonna be here, so
Nimmst du dafür das
Oh,
Geld hinter dir?
places in the world.
Na los, rein.
yes.
The one is,
That's all right.
so this is the one with seafood, and the other two are vegetarian.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I was going to cook, but then my.
And take a little shot also about all the other pictures and his whole house there like that.
Okay, Kieran.
Yeah, come on this side. Let him finish shooting here.
Verschoben gewesen.
You know, just then from there to take the picture also, they close up that and the glass.
Musst du Wasser? Okay.
Eine Zeit.
And what, take a one,
Betten brauchen wir noch. Gläser sind schon drin.
beside the washroom. Vegas, Nasdaq. I met them on a Chinese family, so they live in Las Vegas. They back moved to China. They have acupuncture and they all kind of things they stayed there. So when I was visiting China, so if by the Indian things I have the cold water, they give me warm water. I said, I don't want warm water. They're looking at me like that. I asked them some knife or gun. So why are you looking like that? They said, because they don't want to put your system. Okay. They explaining me why is that. Because when we eat, anything's thrown there, in the cold water, it's stuck there. When you breathe, in the air, dust, virus, everything goes there, stuck there. That's what's creating. After that, my whole family, my son and daughter, my wife, no waiting the cold water, no more.
Oh.
Just the hot water.
And you
Like
like
warm
green
water,
tea?
I like all of green tea.
Oh, I could have made you some green tea because I
When
drink
I
green
was in
tea.
China 2-3 times, with the close to the Mongolia border, my Russians. Who's coming there? Somebody I know. So like, they treat me very bad.